a departmental lecturer in phonology at the University of Oxford. She did her undergraduate in French and linguistics at the Queen's College in Oxford, where she also got her MPhil. And then in 2013, she completed her doctoral thesis from Jesus College at Oxford, supervised by Aditi Lahiri. And her doctoral thesis compares children in Breton medium education with older traditional speakers, focusing on their use of word order and initial consonant mutation. Since then, she has worked as a research assistant and a postdoctoral researcher in the Language and Brain Laboratory in the Faculty of Linguistics at Oxford, where she has done some work on loanword phonology. And in 2015, she had a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship where she looked at how French loanwords are adapted to Breton morphophonology, looking particularly at grammatical gender and metrical stress. And in her talk today, Holly is going to be talking about variation in Breton grammatical gender and initial consonant mutations across new and traditional speakers. So let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much. I hope you can now see my presentation. So yeah, people are nodding. Excellent. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. The research I'm going to talk about is things that I started during the postdoc. I did the fieldwork then, and I'm continuing to work on it now. So it's really nice to be able to begin to give a talk where I don't have to start by telling you all what Breton is and where it's spoken, because you all know that already. So it's nice just to be able to dive in and tell you about it. In my title, I talk about new as opposed to traditional speakers. So I do want to give you a little bit of background about that. So as we, I think, all know, there's a history of language decline and revitalization in Breton, as in the other Celtic languages. And we see really a gap in language transmission from parent to child following the Second World War. However, language revitalization efforts have led to an increased visibility of Breton. I've given you some lovely Breton signage that you can see out and about in Brittany. This is part of the attempts to end the stigma that was attached to speaking Breton. Aside from that, we have the establishment of Breton medium education, beginning in the 1970s with D1, the Breton medium schooling system. So today we have a new group of speakers who have acquired the language by means other than intergenerational transmission. As a proportion of the number of speakers as a whole, that it's quite small. So the most recent survey that's been done of Breton and Breton speakers was in 2018, and around 5% of speakers surveyed were under 40. However, if we look at the group of speakers aged 15 to 24, we see that 90% of them acquired Breton through formal education as opposed to at home. In September 2019, there were almost 19,000 pupils across Brittany and the Loire-Atlantique département, which isn't officially part of the Brittany region, although it was part of the historical region of Brittany. So around that number of people, that number of pupils in Breton medium education, which is around 3% of pupils in Brittany. It's not a huge proportion, but it is increasing year on year. And so we have a growing group of new speakers of Breton. And there have been various claims made regarding their language, what their language is like. So I think we can summarize them by saying that they either come under the heading of purism or French influence. So new speakers are said to have a Celticized lexicon and to avoid French loanwords, to lack traditional phonological features such as stress, Breton stress and liaison, to lack morphophonological features we associate with Celtic languages like mutation, the parts of the verbal paradigm, inflected prepositions. and there's said to be a preference for subject initial word order under influence from French. So what I've been interested in is finding out to what extent these claims are true, because more recent research is starting to challenge some of these claims and to find a more nuanced picture of what new speakers Breton is like. It's clear that new speakers do sound different, but the question is why? What is it about their Breton that makes them sound different? So one of the things I've been looking at is grammatical gender, and I want to give you a quick rundown of gender in Breton. So rather like in Welsh, if you know Welsh, then a lot of this is going to sound pretty familiar. Breton has two genders, masculine and feminine. There aren't that many cues to gender from within the words themselves. So there are some semantic links. So words for men, male animals, male occupations are masculine, and words for women, female animals, female occupations tend to be feminine. But otherwise, there's not a lot you can tell. It's very difficult to tell the gender of a word from its meaning. Equally, the morphology and phonology don't tell you very much either, though there are some feminine suffixes, including the singulative marker n. So there are some clues that you can in the morphology, but for the most part, you can't tell the gender of a noun by looking at it. Noun gender is expressed through limited agreement. I have this little diagram for you. So limited agreement with some numerals. So the numerals 2, 3, and 4 agree with the gender of the noun. There's mutation of the noun following the article and mutation of an adjective that follows a noun. So this is really an opaque system which relies heavily on mutation, and that kind of raises the question of what younger speakers or new speakers do. Is the mutation maintained, or are we seeing some kind of language change? And I'm going to be talking about these three main areas that cue us into grammatical gender. I have also looked at mutation of the noun following the numeral, because the numerals themselves trigger mutation on the noun, but I haven't got time, I haven't got the space to talk about that today. I'm sure you're all familiar with initial consonant mutation. Just to say that what I mean is the change in the initial consonant of a word under certain morphosyntactic conditions. Breton has 4 types of mutation. Lenition, also known as the soft mutation, where voiceless stops become voiced, voiced stops become fricatives, the cluster gua simplifies, and the nasal m also becomes a fricative. We then have spirantization, where voiceless stops become fricatives. Breton also has provection and the mixed mutation, but I'm not going to talk about those today because they don't feature in the mutation that's associated with grammatical gender. And for those of you not familiar with the complexities of Breton orthography, the very typical C'(H) is either a glottal or a velar fricative. This depends on the context and the speaker, and actually I'm not too worried about the actual realization of this phoneme. It's clear if it's a fricative that it's been mutated, so I'm not going to worry about that anymore. So let's have a look at some patterns of gender and mutation. So I've given you 4 nouns, 2 masculine and 2 feminine. So we have a kind of generic masculine noun and the masculine nouns that begin with k, then a generic feminine noun, and then a feminine noun that begins with d. And you can see, well, first of all, we have 2 different forms of the numerals. So for masculine nouns, we have daou and teir, and for feminine nouns, we have daou and teir. So far, so good, very like Welsh. If we look at the mutation patterns, we can see that feminine nouns lenite following the article, but masculine nouns do not. And this goes for all feminine nouns except those that begin with D. We don't get mutation here. Attributive adjectives lenite following feminine nouns, whether or not they begin with D, but not following masculine nouns. You'll see that two, the numeral two, also provokes lenition on the following noun. And then if we look at masculine nouns that begin with K, they spirantise following the article. And we also get spirantization following the numeral 3. So it's quite a complicated system. This is why I'm saying that it's an opaque gender system, because cues to gender are contradictory and they're not readily available to speakers. For example, lenition can apply to both feminine and masculine nouns. So in the previous table, we only had singular nouns, and we see that feminine singular nouns mutate following the article, but so do masculine plural nouns that refer to humans. So we've got lenition, signaling masculine and feminine and singular and plural. So that's quite confusing. Only certain consonants undergo each type of mutation. So there are a lot of nouns that don't mutate at all. And so the mutation isn't a clue to what their gender is. The noun frais for nose is frais. It's a masculine noun, but you can't tell that from the mutation pattern. In addition to this, there are mutable nouns that do not mutate. So where we would expect to see mutation, but we don't. So this can be systematic, as in the case of de following the articles, it just doesn't mutate. That's just a rule of the mutation system. And then we have one-off exceptions as well. So the noun plach, noun for girl, it's feminine, but we say ach plach. It just doesn't mutate, it's idiosyncratic. If we look at the mutation of adjectives, which I'm going to do a little bit later on, I'm going to show you how that it is conditioned by additional phonological factors as well. So this is quite a complicated system, and it has been shown that opaque systems such as this are more difficult for children to acquire. And this is particularly true in the minority language context, where the input is reduced, as has been shown for Welsh, for example, by Thomas and Gathercole. So this led to certain questions for me. So my big question really is how do speakers from different linguistic backgrounds use gender and mutation in Breton? And a kind of following from that, what conditions any variation we might see? And are younger speakers maintaining traditional Breton patterns in their morphophonology, which is kind of counter to the claims that have been made about new speakers and what their Breton is like? So as I've said, today I'm going to talk to you about the three main gender markers. So the agreement of numerals 2 and 3, the mutation of nouns following the indefinite article, and the mutation of adjectives following nouns. And then I also have some additional data. I hope I'm going to fit all of this in. So I have some native speaker perspectives on grammatical gender, which are quite interesting. And then I have a little bit of experimental evidence to show you as well. So to the data that I'm presenting today come from my fieldwork visits to Southwest Brittany, where I've worked with 3 groups of Breton speakers of different ages and from different linguistic backgrounds. So today I've got data from 8 older adults. These are my traditional speakers. So they grew up speaking Breton with their parents at home, and most of them can't read and write Breton. I then have a set of younger adults who are all fluent speakers. They use Breton on a daily basis, but most of them didn't grow up speaking Breton at home. They acquired Breton in some other way. I then have a large group of teenage speakers who are all, or who were at the time of the fieldwork, students at the Liseidi in Carré. So this is the school for pupils aged 15 to 18. It's the only Breton medium lycée that exists in Brittany or elsewhere. And the students come from a variety of linguistic backgrounds, but few of them come from exclusively Breton speaking homes. Now, I have a big sort of pool of teenage speakers. I refer to them as the Liseidi, so the lycée students. And because I made several visits, I saw different students for different tasks at different times. So when I present the data, I'll tell you how many students took part in the task. I hope that's clear. Just to show you where I went, this is a map of Brittany. I'm usually based around here in Quimper. And when I work with speakers, this is the area I tend to visit roughly. So west as far as Plauzevet, and then east up towards Carré, which is sort of quite central in Finistère, and so around Plonévé-du-Fao and Spézet, those sorts of areas, if you know Brittany at all. But that's roughly where I'm going. In terms of Breton dialect, this is all one roughly dialect area, and this is all Kernévec or Cornouaillais. So I'm not expecting to see a lot of regional variation from speaker to speaker. I mean, this is Brittany, so there can be variation from village to village, but it's all roughly the same dialect area. So to elicit my data, to get data from people, I used a series of elicitation tasks. So looking first at the nouns and the numerals, I chose a set of 36 nouns, 16 masculine and 20 feminine, of which 18 had a mutable consonant and 18 did not. And for each one, I created a set of 4 pictures so that I had a single example of whatever my noun was, and then 2, then 3, and then many. The idea being that speakers would use the noun with the indefinite article, the numeral 2, the numeral 3, and then give me it in the plural. So I've given you an example. This is cat. We have a has, daugas, trihas, kisha. So I had that for my 36 nouns. I always use pictures because my older speakers are not literate in Breton. So asking them to read a word list or anything like that would be, well, not very easy for them. I also want them to use the word that's most natural for them, so that I get the most natural speech possible. So this is the method I've found most effective. I did something similar for adjectives. So here I had the same set of nouns, except I didn't use saint because semantically it was a bit odd. So I had 15 masculine and 20 feminine nouns, and I gave them a set of 2 pictures, and I asked them to say for chair, for example, a big chair, a small chair. So au gars de vras, au gars de vian. And that gave me each noun with 2 adjectives. Right, so that gives you, I'll tell you more about the experimental stuff later on, but that gives you an idea of what I was doing and how I got the data. So let's jump right in and look at the data for the numerals. So here in this graph, we have the use of the numeral 2, so daou or diou, and I'm showing you when it was the expected numeral, when it matched the gender of the noun, and when it was unexpected, so when it didn't match the dictionary gender of the noun. And you can see that for the adults, we're around 90% expected usage. For the teenage speakers, it's a bit less. And if I then show you the same graph, but for the numeral 3, again, we're up pretty high for expected usage for the adults, which is great. People are doing what we expect them to do. But for the teenage speakers, it's a bit lower. And what you can't see just from that block on the graph is the amount of variation that we have from speaker to speaker among the teenage speakers. So the adults, it's pretty much consistent across the speakers, but I show you, I'm sorry, this is a slightly horrible graph because there are so many speakers in it. This is a subset of 20 speakers, which I've picked out so you can see some of the interspeaker variation. There were 32 in total who did this task. You can see that, so I've put a green box around these speakers because they have an adult-like usage of the numeral, whereas these speakers that I'm outlining in red, well, we're about the 50-50 mark. So it's almost chance, really. The same is true of the numeral 3. We've got fewer speakers, so it was a bit easier to see. So these 2 speakers were over 80, well, we're around 80% expected numeral. So teir for a feminine noun, tri for a masculine noun. But these speakers, it's much lower. And when I saw these results, I started, well, I already had an inkling because obviously I'd listened to all of these fieldwork recordings, and I started to think, are speakers actually making a distinction between the 2 different forms of the numeral? So I went back through the data and looked at how much, I simply counted how much my teenage speakers used each of the two forms of the numeral. So this is what this graph is showing you. So the pale blue is when they use daou, and the dark blue is when they use daou. I should say it wasn't just that some speakers only gave me feminine or masculine nouns. We should expect a kind of 50-50 rough split here. Maybe a few more daou than daou. But actually what we find, as you can see, these speakers use either exclusively or almost exclusively one numeral. They don't seem to have a distinction between masculine and feminine numerals. They're not really doing numeral agreement. Interestingly, it's not always the same numeral. Some of them prefer the feminine, some of them prefer the masculine, and they just use it for every noun. This includes nouns like girl and boy. So really kind of nouns that have a really strong semantic element as well. So they really don't have that system in their Breton. The same is true of teir and teir. So these speakers, it's just one form really. They're not using masculine and feminine forms of the numeral. I then had a look at whether there was anything kind of conditioning whether speakers were using the expected numeral or not. And I wondered whether there was anything about the noun that conditioned that, and namely whether or not it mutates. So if the noun mutates, as I talked about earlier, we have another cue to its gender. If the noun doesn't mutate, if it begins with a consonant that doesn't mutate, we're not getting a clue to its gender from the mutation patterns. So I had a look at this, and you can see that for the adults, if the noun mutates, they're slightly more likely to use the expected numeral. Whereas for the teenage speakers, it doesn't seem to make much difference. And I have almost an identical graph for 3. So it does seem to make a difference for the adults, but for the teenagers, it doesn't. Finally, I had a look at what I've called consistency. So if speakers use daou for a noun, do they use teir? And if they use daou, do they use teir? And for the most part, speakers are pretty consistent. It's a bit lower for the lycée students, but that's not really very surprising because some of them only use one or the other numeral. So we're not expecting great things. And here again, I have a subset of speakers who did both of the tasks. So I was able to get some idea of consistency. So a quick summary of my findings. Speakers are largely using the numerals as expected. So that's great. We've got morphological agreement. There are some exceptions among the Liseidi, and this, I think, is because some speakers only have one form of the numeral. They don't seem to have acquired both. The mutation of the noun plays a role in the selection of the form of the number. So among the adults, if the noun can mutate, speakers are more likely to use the expected form of the numeral. What I also found was that for some nouns, they were much more likely to have an unexpected numeral. So those kind of exceptions where we get an unexpected numeral are driven largely by a small group of nouns. For all speakers, these were cloch, marnik, and chuitel, so bell, glove, and whistle. And for the lycée students, 2 others, so bark and kader, they're both feminine nouns. Bark, I'm not terribly interested in. It was the first picture, and I think sometimes speakers hadn't quite got their heads around the task at that point, so I'm not too worried about that one. But it's interesting that the noun for chair features there as well. So of these, cloch is masculine, but a lot of speakers treat it as feminine. The others are all feminine nouns, and they're often treated as masculine. For most speakers, numeral choice is consistent, but there's a bit more variation among the lycée students, as you would expect. So that's the form of the numeral. Let's turn now to the mutation in singular nouns following the article. So the expected pattern, I'm just recapping for you, is that we get lenition of feminine nouns following the article, except nouns that begin with D, where we don't get any mutation. And for masculine nouns, we don't get mutation unless they begin with K, in which case we get spirantization. So if we look first at masculine nouns, largely we see what we expect. There's very little mutation of masculine nouns following the article. These are apart from K, we'll come to K in a minute. There are 10 instances among the Liseidi, which makes up 6.25 of relevant responses. 7 of these are with the same noun, and it's gwili. And I think this, so a lot of speakers are saying ogwili instead of ogwili. But I think it's because they use the noun for bed in the expression "go to bed." I mean, that's a very common expression, and in that case, they use it with the preposition "da," which causes mutation. So they hear "dawili" much more often than they hear "gwili," and so we're getting a kind of contamination effect there. I then have single examples for these other nouns. They're just one-offs. Masculine nouns that begin with K, when they follow the article, I get 100% spirantization. So I have 142 responses, and in all of them I get spirantization, which is great, entirely as expected. So this mutation is alive and well. Let's now look at feminine singular nouns, because they're a little bit more interesting. So what we expect is that, so I've not included nouns that begin with D in this graph. So we would expect everything to be light blue. So anything that's not light blue is unexpected. So you can see that for all speaker groups, there's a little bit, there's a few examples where we don't get mutation that we would expect. For the lycée students, we also get a little bit, only a very little bit, of spirantization. So most of the exceptions are the noun for glove, and we get amonic, and we should get avonic. Interestingly, this was one of the nouns that was particularly likely to have an unexpected numeral. I think a lot of speakers, for them, this noun is masculine, even though all the literature says it should be feminine. A lot of speakers treat this as masculine. For the lycée students, we get a little bit of spirantization, mainly with nouns that begin with K. Strangely, I have a few examples like oflach for oplach. I don't know why, they're just strange idiosyncrasies. There are 32 teenagers took part in this task. I can't really show you a graph, it was too busy. So I'll just tell you that there's again a lot of interspeaker variation. I have a range from 33.3% lenition to 100% lenition. 29 out of 32 speakers have lenition in at least 50% of nouns. For 17 speakers, it's 75% of nouns or greater, and I have 3 speakers where it was over 90%. So it gives you some indication of the degree of variation across speakers. Excuse me. So that's mutation in singular nouns. Largely what we expect, a little bit of mutation missing, but not very much, especially among the adults. Let's now look at adjectives. Now, I was really interested to look at adjectives because a lot of the literature looks at nouns, and there isn't an awful lot about use of mutation in adjectives. It's similar to the mutation in nouns following the article, in that we get adjectives lenite following feminine singular nouns and masculine plural nouns that refer to humans. So it's the same context. However, there are additional constraints. So all adjectives lenite following in this context of following feminine singular nouns that end in vowels or sonorants, but following nouns that end in obstruents, we only get lenition of adjectives that begin with b, g, gw, and ma. So this is the voiced stops minus d. We've already talked about restrictions on the lenition of d. In fact, there are some dialects of Breton where d never lenites. That's not true in this part of Brittany, but it is, for some reason, lenition of d seems to be becoming more and more restricted. So I've given you an example here. So we have 3 nouns, a masculine noun, a feminine noun ending in a sonorant, and a feminine noun ending in an obstruent. And I have 2 adjectives. So brasse, beginning with B, and course, beginning with K. And you can see that both, so we don't get neither of them lenite following a masculine noun, both lenite following carda with an obstruent, with a sonorant ending, but only brasse lenites following an obstruent. So it's quite a complicated system. So in this study, I'm only using adjectives that begin with B. It's already clear mutation can be very variable, so I wanted to reduce the factors that might induce further variation. And I hope one day I might be able to go back to Brittany and look at a few more adjectives, because I think this could be quite interesting. But for the time being, I think I was right in suspecting there would be a lot of variation. So this is the mutation of adjectives following feminine nouns. Again, we would expect all of this to be light blue if people did what the grammar books say. But in fact, we have a lot of cases where there's no mutation. And that's not just true of the lycée students, but also the adults. 22 lycée students took part in this task, just to fill you in with that. If we look at the older adults, for the first time, we actually see some interspeaker variation here. Before it's been pretty consistent across speakers, but here we have speakers who never lenite the adjective following the noun, which really surprised me, and speakers who do it nearly all of the time, and then a lot of people are in the middle. If we look at the younger adults, actually the younger adults use mutation a little bit more than the older adults, probably because they learned Breton in a more formal environment. So a lot of them acquired Breton not at home, but through some form of education, so that they have a more standardized form of Breton, and they're perhaps more aware of mutation rules. You know, they're consciously following the rule, whereas perhaps the older adults are not. There's still a fair bit of variation, as you can see. And then if we look at the lycée students, which I thought just about fit on the slide without it being too crazy, really all I want you to see is that there are speakers who never use mutation in adjectives, and speakers who are kind of approaching adult proficiency. So if we look at OK, so all my speakers have 2 initials randomly assigned. So OK is probably the closest to adult usage, whereas some of the others are much more use mutation much less. So I wondered what might be driving this mutation, apart from just idiosyncratic behaviour on the part of the speakers. So I looked at whether the noun mutates and whether this makes a difference as to whether the adjective mutates. So and it does. So if the noun begins with a consonant that can mutate, then the adults are more likely to mutate the adjective, which kind of makes intuitive sense. I think you kind of match your mutation from the noun to the adjective. It doesn't seem to make any difference for the lycée students. What I found particularly interesting was that speakers seem to be aware of this. So I've given you here a little excerpt of a conversation between 2 speakers. So these are older adults who were doing the elicitation task, or at least HX was doing the elicitation task, and her husband was there sort of nosily watching what she was doing. She's looking at a picture. I was aiming for family, but she actually uses a different word, which is nice because then we get this interesting exchange. So AA is her husband and HX is the speaker. And so he chimes in before she can say anything with a big household, and teir is brasse. And she says, yes, and she repeats it. And she said, but isn't it vras? And she tries it out for herself. Antiegus bras. And he says, oh no, you say a household antiegus. Yes, you don't say antiegus with a mutation. She quite agrees with this. No, antiegus. So it has to be bras with no mutation. And she says, oh, well, yes, all right then. And she says it again, antiegus bras. And then she says, but famille vras, a big family. And famille is a feminine noun, and she uses the mutation. And he says, oh, yeah, he agrees. Oh, yes. It's got. I wish I could have played it, but I don't think it would have worked terribly well. But it's quite a funny exchange as they disagree with each other. So speakers are aware of this cue to noun gender that they get from the mutation of the noun following the article. I also looked at whether the word final consonant made a difference as to whether speakers mutated the adjective. Now, it shouldn't make a difference for adjectives that begin with B, but it does. So it seems as though, so speakers are more likely to mutate the adjective if the noun ends in a sonorant. And this is the condition for mutating adjectives that begin with voiceless stops. But it seems as though that rule has sort of bled into other adjectives as well, because it seems to make a difference for bras and billon as well. And finally, before I move on from talking about adjectives, I thought, well, are speakers mutating adjectives following masculine nouns, given we've got this much variation? And so they shouldn't be, but they are a little bit. It kind of creeps up as the speakers get younger. So the Lycée students mutate adjectives more following masculine nouns than any other speaker group, but it's still under 20%. So it's not very much. And we've already seen how there are some nouns where speakers seem quite convinced that they're masculine, even if the dictionaries think that they're feminine. So just to give you a quick summary, we're seeing a lot of inter and intra-speaker variation. However, the mutation following feminine singular nouns is largely maintained by the adult speakers. There's a lot of variation among the Lycée students, but many of them are using mutation at least some of the time, but there might be some confusion over the mutation context. And it seems it matters whether the noun can mutate, because that gives you a cue to gender, and it matters what the final sound of the noun is. So I was quite interested in how much speakers were aware of the gender of nouns, partly because these little excerpts came up in the course of my fieldwork. So I have two quotations for you from my older adults, and what's interesting is that their ideas about masculine and feminine are heavily informed by French, even though they're using Breton gender agreement in their numerals. And in a way, this isn't a surprise. They haven't had any formal instruction in Breton. So all kind of grammatical labels are associated with French because it's the language of education for them. So I have AO, and she says, so I've given you the quote in French, but I'll talk you through it. So she says, du vague, which is boat, two boats. We say du, but it's odd because it's masculine. It's not masculine in Breton, but bateau, the French word, is masculine. So she's thinking of it as a masculine word. But in Breton, often we say feminine. We don't say daou vague, du. It's odd, even though boat is masculine, and she says it in French. So it strikes her as odd, but it's almost like she's never thought about it this way before. And then I have another speaker who does something very similar. Again, this was a speaker with a husband who interrupted. So she sees the picture of trees, and she says trees in French. And so he chimes in helpfully with teir gwyn, so three trees. And so she repeats it, and then she tries it out with the masculine numeral, and then concludes, oh no, teir gwyn. And then she says, you see, it's not the same, because we say a tree, so masculine, and there in Breton we say it in the feminine, teir gwyn. My youngest speakers have a slightly different perspective. So this is an excerpt from a younger adult, and he says, I find it's complicated actually, this masculine feminine thing, especially words that begin with a vowel, because you don't have a mutation. So words that don't mutate, very often, I don't know if they are masculine or feminine. You don't have the context to know. You see, tea, for me, that's easy, it's obvious. Tea is the word for house. But arvel, I can't say, even though it's apple, right? It's a simple word. Du arvel, dau arvel, both sound okay. So I found it really interesting, the contrast between the older speakers for whom this was really quite intuitive, and then my younger adults who were very fluent and competent in Breton, but who don't have a feeling for which nouns are feminine and which nouns are masculine necessarily. And so finally, I want to tell you very quickly about a perception experiment, because this, I think, adds to my picture of what do speakers know about gender in Breton. I have to say, as an experiment, it wasn't hugely successful for reasons that will become clear, but I think it's still quite interesting what it tells us. So in this experiment, I showed participants a word on the screen, and I asked them to tell me if it was masculine or feminine. They had a little button box marked masculine and feminine. I only ran this with the teenagers because it was the only opportunity I had to do an experimental setup. And the point of this experiment was that in some cases I used the expected mutation, but in others I didn't. So I gave them the definite article plus the noun. I had nouns that began with voiceless stops. And I had a mixture of the correct mutation, some other mutation, and no mutation at all. And every time it was presented with the definite article, I had masculine and feminine nouns, and I had a kind of even spread of the two. So this was my experimental setup. It's not very high tech. You can't see the screen, I'm afraid. It's to the right. On the wall there was a whiteboard that I projected the words on, and then you can just about see the button boxes and the headphones and the students sat there. So this is in the library at the school. So they would see, for example, Arvam, the mother, and they would press feminine. But if they saw Antad, the father, they would press masculine. And I wanted to know whether unexpected mutations made it more difficult to process the noun. So whether I would see less accurate responses and slower reaction times. But actually, I just got really high error rates throughout, which now that I have my production data, or now that I've analysed the production data, that's not really a surprise. The error rates are slightly lower when the mutation is the correct one, but there's lots of interspeaker variation. So here are my error rates. You can see that the incorrect response is given around half the time, but that when the mutation is the expected mutation, it's slightly better. However, the difference is very small. Looking at the reaction times, there's so little difference. There's nothing really to say there. Participants are no slower when the form is incorrect. But my main finding really from this, although it was slightly disappointing as an experiment, was that the Lycée students are really unsure about the gender of nouns. And actually, when I explained the task to them, that it was very clear that this was how it was going to go, because they all sort of looked terrified at the prospect of having to decide the gender of nouns, or groaned and said they found that really difficult. And I think really this is reflected in my error rates. So a quick run through my conclusions. So Breton clearly has complex patterns of grammatical gender agreement and initial consonant mutation. It has an opaque system of grammatical gender, so the cues for gender are not readily available to speakers. Older speakers seem to have quite clear intuitions about gender, but younger speakers may not. And despite the opaque system that we've got, adult new speakers are maintaining traditional patterns. So in numeral agreement and mutation following the article, which is very encouraging, and in fact runs counter to claims about what new speakers Breton is like. The patterns of adjectival mutation show a high degree of variation, but this is true of all speaker groups, including the older adults, and I think reflects the fact that it's a more complex system. I'm seeing a lot of variation among my teenage speakers, which I think reflects this extended process of acquisition that we have in minority language immersion schooling. And I'm starting to look at home background and how that has an effect on their use of language as well. But sadly, I'm out of time. I can't tell you any more about that. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing the screen and then I can see people's pictures. That's better.
All right. Thank you very much, Holly. That was really great. We have a lot of questions here, so I'll just get right to it. I will moderate the question period, but if it's your question, I might ask you to elaborate or spell it out more, especially Mike's, because he posts a lot of really weird ones. So the first question is from Mike Hammond, and he has a question about the distribution of genders in borrowed versus native vocabulary in Breton. Mike, do you want to say a little more?
Sorry, I'll just explain. So this is against the backdrop of Welsh. So two things. One, in Welsh, there's this massive asymmetry between masculines and feminines. I'm wondering, first, is the same thing true in Breton? That is, lots more masculines.
Yes, it is true. There are more masculine than feminine nouns. I can't remember it quite. I mean, I'm not sure actually whether I have figures, but yes, there are more masculines than feminine nouns, and masculine tends to be the default gender.
Yeah. So and what about in borrowings? Is the same distribution hold in borrowings, or is it different? In Welsh, it shifts a little. Borrowings tend to be more feminines.
I think it's probably about the same. I'm trying to think about my data. So I have a lot. I mean, it's impossible to avoid borrowings.
Yeah. So the Welsh borrowing pattern that's weird is if a word is borrowed and it begins with a consonant that looks like it's already mutated, then it wants to be feminine.
Right.
So in other words, a word like vinegar, that wants to be feminine, right? Because it has a V, and a V looks like it's been mutated. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize. Awesome talk, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think so. It's slightly more complicated in Breton because French has gender. So I think sometimes words get borrowed with their gender. Like, I don't know, crocodile is masculine. Yeah, I'd have to look more at my data to find out exactly, but I think it's a kind of fairly even split.
Yeah, no, that observation, the one you just made about the fact that they're borrowing from a language with gender, and those utterly awesome conversations you had at the end about their awareness of gender, that really makes for a really interesting comparison to the other cases. Anyway, I'll stop. Really nice.
All right. The next question is also actually from Mike, complimenting the picture task, and is asking about its virtues with respect to a translation task. Do you want to elaborate on this?
Sorry, I liked your picture task. We did in both Gaelic and Welsh, we used a translation task following Dorian, I think. Was that who we followed? People are nodding. Following Dorian. But I mean, your task has virtues in that there's no translation involved, I'm assuming. I mean, was the experiment entirely in Breton, or was there French, or?
It depended on the speaker. So a lot of the older speakers find it weird when I speak Breton to them. I mean, Breton's not that great. And also for them, it's very much an in-group language that they only use with very close family and friends, or potentially nobody if, they can be quite elderly and isolated. So it's weird if we have conversations in Breton. I think I went for pictures rather than translation, because if I use translation, I get a lot of French influence so I'm more likely to get a borrowing. When I was doing work with word order for my thesis, I found it was really problematic using translation. So I started using pictures, and then I've kind of stuck with that as a methodology.
Yeah, no, this is really an invitation to a longer discussion when we have time. I just think the picture task is a very nice idea.
All right, the next question was from me. So you pointed out a few specific words, a few specific nouns using the unexpected variant of the numerals 2 and 3. Were there any patterns that you noticed among them as far as their phonology or semantics that would lead to some sort of natural grouping of those in any way?
Sadly not, no. It seems really idiosyncratic. But I presented some of this data in Brittany and I got speakers. So I didn't tell them that, so I just said, oh, what about glove? What do you think? And made them like vote as to whether it was masculine or feminine. And they had really strong feelings that it was masculine or that it was feminine. I don't know why this is. But there are nouns in Breton which can be either gender, and that's recognized. So the noun for one of the words for bucket, or sai, can be masculine or feminine, and that's a well-known fact. But I think the fact that glove fitted into this category was news to everybody. I don't know why. It's just and huitel is weird. El is usually a feminine suffix. It's not a suffix in huitel, but it sort of looks feminine, right? But a lot of people said it was masculine.
Right.
Yeah.
The next question is also one of Mike's. So for the speakers who don't use daou, do they still know that the noun is feminine or is supposed to be feminine?
That's difficult to say. What I would need to do, and I would like to do this, but I haven't done it yet, is look at whether speakers. So I've looked at consistency across the two numerals. I need to look at whether they also, so if they mutate the noun, do they then use daou and teir? And if they don't mutate the noun, do they use daou and tri?
Yeah, of like, imagine, just to put it in Welsh, because I don't know how to say the Breton one, something I can give you a Welsh, right? So something like cath, and which is cat, feminine, should be dwy gath, right? Mm-hmm. So imagine the person says dau gath. You can't tell from the mutation because it would get the same mutation. But dwy gath vach, dau gath bach, or vach.
Yeah.
That would be the equivalent kind of test.
Yeah, I mean, because Breton has an indefinite article, we can get mutation following the article, so that can be a clue, and that seems to be a strong cue anyway. So yeah, I need to compare usage following the article with usage of numerals. I think given the performance in the experiment that I did, there are at least some of the lycée students who just don't really know what gender different nouns are, and it's a bit random. But yeah, that's something I'd like to look at.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Colleen, and she's asking if it's the same participants who use primarily one form for 2 and for 3, or does it vary?
Largely yes, but not necessarily. Which doesn't make any sense. But, yeah.
That's fine. I was just curious.
The next question. So I'm curious about the sort of the differences within the Liseidi population. If you've looked at all, if the proportion of expected versus unexpected responses changes depending on which year they're in. So maybe, if the people who are sort of younger perform differently than the people who are older in the school.
Yeah. I don't think it makes any difference. So I haven't run statistics on everything, but for the most part, age doesn't seem to be a factor certainly in mutation usage. I'm not sure about numeral usage, but I think it's unlikely. The difference is very small. By the time they arrive at the lycée at age sort of 15, they're pretty fluent in Breton. So even by age 18, I mean, we might see a bit more, but yeah.
Sure. I was kind of thinking, because I think in your paper on the mixed mutation, there did seem to be a difference, if I remember, between the younger speakers didn't quite have it acquired yet, whereas the older students did finally.
Yeah.
So that was similar.
Yeah, I mean,
here.
It's a bigger age gap, because my youngest speakers there were aged about sort of 9 or 10, and then they went up to kind of 15, 16. So.
Okay, cool. The next one is kind of a hybrid question from both Mike and Carrie. So talking about the D effect, where D does not mutate. Mike remarks that this seems reminiscent of Gaelic N, and Carrie also mentions that there's a similar thing in Irish that deals with coronals. So Carrie asks, do other coronals like T behave differently in Breton as well?
So T doesn't. D is kind of exceptional in other ways, though, because in the mixed mutation, the D is the one that makes it mixed. So the mixed mutation looks like lenition, apart from D, which is provection. So I don't know what it is about voice.
Just to clarify, so the N effect is a homogeneity effect. So this is Gaelic, and I'm going to misremember it. So Andrew or one of you Gaelic people, stop me. But I think what I recall we found is that the N effect, where mutation of the coronal would be blocked by a preceding N, what we found is that when that N is not overt, that effect seems to be getting lost among speakers of Gaelic. Now, what you seem to be finding is rather than the mysterious homogeneity effect being lost, it seems to be extending so that the relevant consonants never mutate even when they're not in that environment. Is that a correct statement of? I mean, they're both dealing with an opacity problem in a sense, but they're dealing with it in opposite directions.
Yeah. So so we do get lenition of D, but we don't get it in a lot of contexts, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where we would expect to see it. And then there are dialects where we never get lenition of D. It just seems to have dropped off altogether.
That really just seems like I said, there's this opacity in both languages, and they're resolving it, or at least those dialects are resolving it in a completely different direction than what we're seeing in the Gaelic case, which is awesome, because of course now we want to know why. But anyway, great, thank you.
All right, the next question is from Colleen. So she asks, do you know much about the typical linguistic background of instructors at the Diwan in Carhaix? If most students don't have Breton input at home, she's curious about the impact of peers and staff on their language.
Yeah, so the most of the teachers are speakers themselves. That wasn't true when D1 was founded, but obviously we're quite a few decades further on now. So the teachers themselves are younger, new speakers. So peer group language is really important. However, it's not as important as you might think, because getting students to use the language outside the classroom can have its own challenges. So when they're off going around Carhaix, they speak French. Or not all of them, but there is a strong tendency to switch to French outside of the educational setting, which is a recognised issue.
Right. We have kind of a related question from Johannes. He asks, do the younger adults who are using Breton on a daily basis, as you said, speak more with traditional speakers or more with other Neo-Breton speakers? And does the different contacts have an influence on their way of saying things?
So it varies from speaker to speaker how much they interact with older speakers. Some of them have an older relative that they speak with, and that may have an impact. So not a parent, but another relative who is a Breton speaker, so a grandparent, or I think somebody had an uncle or something like that. That can have an impact. I have one speaker in particular whose use of mutation following the numerals is much more like an older speaker, and his lexicon as well has regionalisms in it, and it's because he had family members who spoke Breton, even though he didn't grow up speaking it with his parents. So there is a difference there, but it's very, it's very idiosyncratic. It's hard to see clear patterns. Oh, obviously I only have a small group of speakers, so.
All right, Andrew, do you want to ask about your observation?
Yeah, so it was actually the accuracy of the older Breton speakers that surprised me. How accurate they were. There's a faculty member here in our Department of French who has studied gender among native speakers of French, and she has found that so-called native speakers of French are range around 75% accuracy, 70 to 75% accuracy.
Oh, wow.
Particularly with respect to choice of article.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if you had any thoughts about that. I mean, that seems really striking to me.
Yeah, that's really surprising, actually, that it's that the Breton, the Breton older adults seem to be more accurate than that in their use of certainly in their use of mutation and the use of the choice of the numeral. It is pretty consistent. I don't know why that would be.
I'll send you the reference to.
Yeah,
it's Dalila Ayoun is her name. Who's done the study? Yeah.
I think we're a little bit low on time, but I will have time for, I think, one more pair of questions from John Powell, who has some questions on gender. Go ahead, John.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Kennard, for this talk. This was very interesting, very, very insightful. A couple quick questions. Dealing with grammatical gender, just coming, with the assumption that we all do that grammatical gender is, by and large, arbitrary. I wanted to see what your thoughts are on, when we look at change over time, we can even see that, throughout languages, we see, and this is sort of piggybacking off of Andrew's question, we can see that, one language will, the gender for a certain noun may change. You can see cognates across Romance languages with different gender. We see that often. So my first question is, I was curious on what your thoughts are if what we're seeing now may be evidence of sort of natural language change, albeit accelerated. If indeed a lot of those future speakers will be some of the ones that you've been pointing to. So that's my first question. And my second question relates to something you mentioned about, I think I might be mistaken. You mentioned that there are some nouns that that a lot of the new speakers are pretty consistent on, things where, the grammatical gender sort of mirrors, like, for example, the gender of, people or whatever it may be. And then I think you mentioned something about professions too. I'm curious on, I'm familiar with, like, for example, within French, the movement of feminizing profession nouns that have historically had a single masculine form and have been sort of prescriptivized by the academy to have that form. But then in light of the movements to innovate feminine forms, like things like surgeon and medical practitioner, president, that kind of thing. To what extent, I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about what you mentioned about the profession nouns, and if there's any analog that you might see there with sort of, the speakers using one gender or another or both.
Yeah, so you asked first about language change. I think this is something that comes up quite a lot in discussions of Breton with the new speakers. Are they going to, so if, unfortunately a lot of older speakers are very elderly, we're going to see a sudden change in Breton where the speaker population becomes predominantly new speakers. And yeah, I think some of the change that we see is like normal language change, as you say, but a bit more accelerated. What's interesting is that because Breton has been standardized as part of this drive to revitalize it, to teach Breton, you need to have some kind of standard. You can't, to publish textbooks and to have agreed forms, and there has been standardization. But as a result, it's almost like language change has gone one way and then gone back again, because we see changes happening among the older speakers. For example, increase in the use of lenition at the expense of other mutations. But then, because that's not what standard Breton does, it's almost like the pendulum swung back again, and we see a decrease in the use of lenition among the younger speakers. So that certainly happens, that we get change kind of going counter to the general sort of tide of change as well. Your other question about masculine and feminine forms that are linked to professions. I mean, the reason is that if it's the suffix that makes the noun feminine, for example. So if you put a feminine suffix like s on the end, so there's lots of there's agentive nouns that are aer, so aer, like pescateur is a fisherman, and then you can make it feminine by having ers with the ezh suffix on the end, so that would make it feminine. But it's an interesting question about whether there's a reaction to this. As you say, French has been shifting so that you don't have the masculine and feminine forms. My answer really is I don't know. My initial instinct is that the kind of Breton Public Language Office has so much to worry about with getting people to actually speak Breton that issues of this sort are much lower priority. There's discussion about what should we use for mathematical terms in schools. Those sorts of questions are much more, what do you call a parallelogram in Breton? There isn't a word for parallelogram. Do you borrow the word from French, or do you build a word in Breton based on something from Welsh? And if you do that, will that disadvantage students who go to do maths at university because they won't have the word parallelogram that's fairly universal across Indo-European languages? So they're much more involved in those sorts of issues than they are, I think, in issues of gender equality. But I may be wrong, and they may be discussing this and I just don't know. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer your question, but it's an interesting idea, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.